Welcome back in here to Live Now from Fox. I am Andy Mack. More than 2 years since the OceanGate Titan submersible disaster, a U.S. Coast Guard report finding that incident was in and of itself preventable. The Coast Guard said the company's safety procedures were, quote, critically flawed, also citing glaring disparities between safety protocols and actual practices. In this 335-page, investigators repeatedly point to OceanGate's culture of downplaying, ignoring, and even falsifying key safety information to improve its reputation and evade scrutiny from regulators. Of course, the submersible implosion that killed 5 aboard the Titanic dive was preventable. This, according to a U.S. Coast Guard report on Tuesday, releasing this, talking about some of those intimidation tactics, exploiting regulatory loopholes. For more on this, let's bring in right now maritime expert, friend of the program, associate professor at Campbell University, Sal Mercogliano. Sal, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And there were just so many red flags leading up to this disaster. What stands out to you in this report?
Oh, good evening, Andy. And you're right. I mean, the amount of warnings that were just blistering is amazing. I just really want to say, number one, I thought the Coast Guard did an extensive report. This is an amazing report, and they are not afraid to actually take punches at themselves. Yeah, there was a culture at OceanGate that did not want to hear any sort of opposition. Right from the very top, we saw that with Stockton Rush, and we saw it throughout that. If you watch the hearings, you saw that. But what was really interesting is that the Coast Guard identified several key areas where Stockton Rush and OceanGate, and again, I think it's really important to note it's OceanGate, it's the corporation, because there are other people involved in this, did their best to circumvent the rules and operate this submersible outside the bounds of rules and regulations. And the Coast Guard was very clear that there needs to be some closing of loopholes so that this cannot happen again.
Yeah, and of course, that is kind of the question I wanted to ask, because they say this is preventable, but there has to be authorities in place to regulate sort of thing. And it feels like the U.S. Coast Guard is the organization or an agency that could be a part of that. Is it fall somewhat on them to look into this, that they did allow this somewhat to fall through those loopholes?
I think it is. And, I was very critical of the Coast Guard at the time, especially during the hearing, because it didn't seem to be really taking much blame. They were really doing what I thought was a very thorough investigation, as this report shows. They're very clear that one of the things that has to be done is that since this craft was built in the United States and OceanGate was a U.S. corporation, there should have been some oversight by the U.S. Coast Guard. There needed to be documentation. There needed to be a classification society. Basically, what Stockton Rush and OceanGate were operating was a stateless, unclassified, unregulated submersible out in the open ocean. And so there was very little rules that existed. But again, for 60 years, this was a safe process where there has been literally no deaths at all at depths. And it's just because Stockton Rush operated in such a way as, basically having people pay to go on board. I mean, this is basically a pleasure craft, and it needed to be regulated as such.
And they said if Stockton Rush was still around, that he could be potentially criminally charged, saying there was exhibited negligence that contributed to the death of those 4 other people, obviously the 5 in total that lost their lives during this disaster. There were other components of this, talking about the hull and the damage of that. How important was that in terms of this report?
Oh, I think it is. I think, number one, even though Stockton Rush did die, there are other liabilities here that's really important. I mean, there are other officers and elements of the corporation at play. Ocean Prince, the vessel that was used in this, is at liability for this. So I don't think everybody got away. Just because Stockton Rush died on board the vessel with 4 passengers doesn't mean that there's not going to be potentially civil suits about this. I think the Coast Guard is really targeting how to deal with this going forward. They targeted, for example, talking with the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, to start regulating submersibles, to ensure that any craft that is built in the United States has a document of inspection, so at least they can track that vessel and know where it is. Again, very critical of themselves here in this report, the Coast Guard.
Yeah, and of course, talking about the hull that they did have damaged years prior to this incident actually happening. And the hull was specifically made out of carbon fiber, and that was a component that made it unique in and of itself compared to other submersibles out there. Did that set that back at all? And do you think there will be future kind of looking into investigations into it by the Coast Guard about the materials in which submersibles are made?
Yeah, I think the use of the carbon fiber obviously got a lot of people's attention. The idea that you're not using titanium and steel in this. However, I don't know if it really precludes it from being used, maybe not at that depth, but definitely with more protection, more inspection, more elements to do it. Let's not forget, we went to the moon in a craft that you can basically put your foot through the side on the lunar module. So, I mean, we've operated in areas where we've had crafts in environments where, they're right on the margin here. But again, that was also space exploration. It was also being done with everybody knowing the risks. Here, we're not clear that the passengers knew the risks. So I think we're going to see new technologies develop. I think Stockton Rush actually took himself in the forefront here for maybe pushing us into new technologies, but there has to be regulation and protection for those who embark on those craft.
Yeah, pushing the boundary. If you kind of put yourself at risk, that is one thing, but putting other people there is another thing. And of course, some of the people on the craft, on the Titan submersible, were labeled as mission specialists to get around some of those regulations. Do you think that will change in the near future?
I think it will. I mean, anytime you're paying for it on board, you're a passenger.
Yeah.
And, if I take somebody out in a boat to go fishing and they're paying for it, I have to have a Coast Guard license. Now, if I take them out on my own private boat and I'm not paying, that's something different. But this was definitely a craft that was for charter and for hire. But again, let's not forget, the Titan was operating out in international waters, an unclassed, unregulated, unstateless craft. So, I mean, Stockton Rush, and it's actually well documented in the Coast Guard report. He went shopping around looking for places where he can avoid regulations, where he can avoid oversight. So there was a conscious decision here by Ocean Gate and Stockton Rush not to get themselves hemmed in by regulation because he thought it would slow him down and prevent him from turning a profit. But unfortunately, what it did was lead to the fatal deaths of those 5 people alongside the Titanic.
And that's what also the report detailed, was some of that toxic workplace culture that he continued to eliminate. And even he, although not really an expert in that, was making engineering decisions that ultimately took the lives of those other people. What other lessons should be taken away from this, Sal? What else can other submersible companies that are also trying to explore the depths of the ocean, explore the Titanic, what other lessons should we take from this?
Well, I can tell you that submersible operators out there are not happy with this. They were running a safe industry. They were going far and beyond. They would argue they didn't need regulation because they knew the dangers. It was Stockton Rush who didn't understand the dangers. And now this is going to put a level of control over them. But again, we're seeing the deep ocean and the ocean becoming more available, more common for everyone. And while you'll have people who use, good measures and do all their due diligence, there are others who don't. And sometimes that's what you want regulation to do. Unfortunately, one of the things we see is that, regulations, especially shipping regulations, are written in blood. And let's not forget the very first of these literally was Titanic and the Safety of Life at Sea Convention that mandated lifeboats and life protection and 24-hour radio monitoring. And in many ways, Titan is going to do the same thing for submersibles that Titanic did for ships.
Yeah, kind of ironic that the twist of fate as they were going down to see the Titanic, obviously the disaster that unfolded. We talked about it, some of the legal liabilities, the civil cases that will proceed for years and years. Does this close the chapter at all in terms of the Coast Guard? Will there be other reports, if at all, from them or other agencies?
I don't think we'll see this from the U.S. Coast Guard. I think this is going to close the book, at least on their investigation. However, we will see regulations coming out. We'll see them pushing more with the International Maritime Organization. Let's not forget, too, this happened on a Canadian vessel out of Canadian port. So we're going to see an investigation come out from Canada, too, on this. I'm not sure you're going to see the end of the liability on this because there is liability issues out there. Ocean Gate was not just Stockton Rush. There are other elements that are involved. There are other parties that are associated with this. Again, the vessel that brought him out to that site is also going to be held culpable here in some ways, and whether or not there should have been some more oversight on this. But I do think for right now that this will close out at least the Coast Guard investigation, but we're not going to see those changes. The question is, Coast Guard is very very thin spread out there with resources. They're underfunded, under-personneled, and doing more missions for them is really not something they look forward to. But now they're going to have to be a little bit more cognizant of this in the area of submersibles.
Yeah, the ocean is so expansive. Obviously, the U.S. Coast Guard doing their best to cover it all, and this obviously disaster happening 2+ years ago. Anything else we're missing, Sal? Anything else that you want to note before I let you go?
I think, again, the ocean is extremely safe and the use of submersibles is extremely safe. 60 years, no major deaths at depth at all until you got into this. And again, I don't want to fault the technology. The technology is, we're going to push the limits here of using new technologies at sea, but they have to be properly tested. And I think what you get very clear in this report was that there was not proper testing. And more importantly, there wasn't a second set of eyes, either a regulatory agency, a classification society that was just making sure that, someone like Stockton Rush or somebody else could push somebody into a dangerous scenario. And, sometimes we get very kind of tunnel vision. We don't see the dangers out there. And I don't think Stockton Rush had a death wish going down at depth. I think he thought he was coming back up at the end of that dive. But unfortunately, sometimes we just don't see that problem that's right in front of us, no matter how many warning signs were going off.
Yeah, he did not see it or did not care to even look potentially in the vicinity because there were just so many red flags. Whistleblowers were out there calling into question some of the practices at Ocean Gate years in advance of this tragedy. Sal, thank you so much. I appreciate your time here, as always, on LiveNOW.
Andy, thank you for having me.
All right, thank you so much. All right, great conversation there, as always, as this closes, at least in part, this saga, the submersible implosion that killed 5 aboard the Titanic dive was, quote, preventable. This according to the U.S. Coast Guard, as the investigation releasing that 300-page report repeatedly point to the culture of downplaying, ignoring, even falsifying key safety information to improve its reputation and evade scrutiny from regulators. The Marine Board concluded that Stockton Rush, the Ocean Gate CEO, exhibited negligence that contributed to the deaths of 4 people. If Rush had survived, the case would have been handed off to the Department of Justice and may have been subject to criminal charges, this according to the board.